My coworker showed me a photo of my dead uncle at a concert and asked, "Didn't we go to his funeral last year?" I stared at the photo on Melissa's phone, my coffee cup frozen halfway to my lips. There he was, clear as day, Uncle Thomas standing in the front row at what looked like a Bruce Springsteen concert, wearing the same gray fedora he'd worn to every family gathering for 20 years. The timestamp on the photo showed it was taken just 3 days ago. "That's impossible," I whispered, my hand starting to shake. "We buried him 13 months ago. I gave the eulogy at his funeral. I watched them lower his casket into the ground." Melissa zoomed in on the photo, concern creeping into her voice. "Danny, that's definitely your uncle. My sister took this picture at the concert in Philadelphia. She said she thought she recognized him from your Facebook posts, but figured it couldn't be the same person since you'd posted about his death last year." The office suddenly felt too small, the fluorescent lights too bright. I grabbed Melissa's phone and studied every detail of the photo. Same weathered face, same crooked nose from when he'd broken it playing high school football, same distinctive scar above his left eyebrow. Even the way he stood with his left shoulder slightly higher than his right, a result of an old construction injury. "There has to be an explanation," I said, though my voice sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Maybe it's someone who looks like him. Maybe your sister was mistaken about when the photo was taken." But even as I said it, I could see other details that made denial impossible. Uncle Thomas was wearing a Springsteen tour shirt that I recognized from the current tour, one that hadn't existed when he supposedly died. And in the background, I could make out part of a venue sign that clearly showed the date as 3 days ago. Melissa gently took her phone back, her expression sympathetic but troubled. "Danny, I'm really sorry to spring this on you like this. Maybe you should call your family and ask some questions. There might be something you don't know about." I nodded mechanically and walked back to my desk, but I couldn't concentrate on work for the rest of the day. Every few minutes, I'd find myself staring at nothing, trying to process what I'd seen. At lunch, I drove to the cemetery where Uncle Thomas was supposedly buried and stood in front of his headstone, reading the inscription I'd helped choose: Thomas Michael Brennan, beloved brother and uncle, 1952-2023. The grave looked perfectly maintained, with fresh flowers that my Aunt Margaret placed there every week. But now I found myself wondering what was actually buried beneath that stone. Had there ever been a body in that casket, or had we all been mourning an empty box? That evening, I called my cousin Sarah, Uncle Thomas's daughter, trying to sound casual. "Hey Sarah, I know this might sound weird, but I was looking through old photos today and started thinking about Uncle Thomas. Do you ever feel like something was off about his death? Like maybe things happened too quickly?" There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah finally spoke, her voice was strained. "Danny, why are you asking about this now? It's been over a year. We all need to move on." "I just keep thinking about how sudden it was," I pressed. "One day he was fine, the next day he was dead from a heart attack, and the funeral arrangements happened so fast. Didn't you think it was strange that they wouldn't let us see the body? They said it was because of the heart attack, but—" "Danny, stop!" Sarah's voice was sharp now. "Whatever you're thinking, just drop it. Some things are better left alone. Family is family and we protect each other. Uncle Thomas is gone, and that's all you need to know." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in confusion. Sarah's reaction was so defensive, so abrupt, that it only raised more questions. Why was she so adamant that I stop asking? And what did she mean by, "we protect each other"? I spent the next few days trying to focus on work, but the photo kept haunting me. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Uncle Thomas's face in that crowd, very much alive and apparently enjoying a rock concert, while his entire family believed he was dead. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to drive to Philadelphia and see if I could find any other evidence. The venue where the concert had taken place was easy enough to locate, and I spent an entire Saturday afternoon showing Uncle Thomas's photo to various staff members and security guards. Most of them just shrugged and said they saw too many faces to remember any particular person. But finally, one of the older security guards looked at the photo more carefully. "Yeah, I remember this guy," he said, scratching his chin. "He's been to a bunch of shows here over the past year. Always sits in the same general area, always wears that hat. Real friendly guy, tips the ushers well. Goes by Tommy, I think." My heart started pounding. "Are you sure it's the same person? You've seen him multiple times?" "Oh yeah, definitely. He's got season tickets for this section. Comes to maybe 8 or 10 shows a year. Always alone, though. Never seen him with family or friends." I thanked the security guard and walked back to my car in a daze. Uncle Thomas wasn't just alive. He'd been living an entirely different life for over a year while we all mourned his death. But why would he fake his own death? And more importantly, who else in the family knew the truth? That night, I called my Aunt Margaret, Uncle Thomas's sister, and the person who'd been most devastated by his supposed death. She'd been the one to call me that morning 13 months ago, sobbing so hard she could barely speak, telling me that Thomas had collapsed at home and died before the paramedics could save him. "Aunt Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I said when she answered the phone. "Is Uncle Thomas really dead?" The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her struggling with how to respond. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "Danny, what kind of question is that? Of course he's dead. I planned his funeral. I've been visiting his grave every week for over a year. Someone photographed him at a concert in Philadelphia 3 days ago, I said firmly. I've seen the picture, Aunt Margaret. It's definitely him. He's alive, and apparently he's been alive this whole time. Another long silence. Then, to my complete shock, I heard Aunt Margaret start to cry. But these weren't tears of grief or confusion. They were tears of what sounded like relief. Oh God, Danny, she sobbed. I hoped you'd never find out. We all hoped you'd never find out. We? Who's we? Aunt Margaret, what the hell is going on? Through her tears, the whole story came pouring out. Uncle Thomas hadn't died of a heart attack. He'd come to the family 13 months ago with a problem that threatened to destroy all of us. He'd been working as an accountant for a construction company that was laundering money for organized crime, and he'd discovered evidence that could send several powerful people to prison for decades. But Thomas hadn't just discovered the money laundering by accident. He'd been secretly documenting it for months, planning to turn the evidence over to the FBI. The criminal organization had found out about his plans and issued an ultimatum: disappear forever, or watch his entire family get eliminated one by one, starting with his daughter Sarah and her 2 young children. The fake death was his idea, Aunt Margaret explained through her sobs. He said it was the only way to keep us all safe. If they thought he was dead, they'd stop looking for him and leave the rest of us alone. But if any of us contacted him or tried to find him, it would put everyone at risk. I felt like the ground was shifting beneath my feet. So the funeral was fake? The casket was empty? We had help from someone Thomas knew in law enforcement, she admitted. Someone who understood the situation and helped us stage everything. The death certificate, the funeral arrangements, even the cremation. It was all fabricated. We told ourselves we were protecting Thomas and protecting the family. But what about his evidence against the criminals? Did he ever turn it over to the FBI? Aunt Margaret's voice got even quieter. That's the thing, Danny. Thomas was supposed to disappear for just a few months while the FBI built their case. But something went wrong. The investigation got compromised somehow, and several key witnesses disappeared or died in suspicious accidents. Thomas realized he couldn't trust anyone in law enforcement, so he just stayed dead. I sat in my car outside the concert venue, trying to process everything I'd learned. My uncle was alive but living in hiding, afraid to contact his own family because of threats from organized crime. Meanwhile, we'd all been grieving his death and visiting an empty grave for over a year. Aunt Margaret, I need to see him, I said finally. I need to talk to Thomas and understand what really happened. Danny, no, absolutely not. It's too dangerous. If those people find out he's alive, they'll kill him for real this time, and they might kill the rest of us too, but I'd already made up my mind. I couldn't just pretend I'd never seen that photo, couldn't go back to visiting an empty grave and mourning someone who was very much alive. I needed answers, and I needed to know why Thomas had chosen to let his family suffer through the pain of his fake death rather than finding another solution. The next morning, I drove back to Philadelphia and started staking out the concert venue. If Thomas really was a regular attendee with season tickets, there was a good chance he'd show up for the next scheduled performance. I felt ridiculous sitting in my car for hours, watching every person who walked by, but I didn't know any other way to find him. After 3 days of fruitless surveillance, I decided to try a different approach. I went back to the security guard who'd recognized Thomas's photo and asked if he knew any other places where Tommy might spend time. The guard mentioned a small jazz club about 6 blocks away that hosted intimate performances on weeknight evenings. That Wednesday night, I found myself sitting in the back of a dimly lit club, nursing a beer and watching the entrance. The jazz trio on stage was playing soft, melancholy tunes that seemed to match my mood perfectly. And then, at exactly 8:30 p.m., I saw him walk through the door. Uncle Thomas looked older than I remembered, his hair grayer and his face more lined with worry. But he moved with the same confident stride, and when he removed his fedora, I could see the same familiar bald spot that had been growing larger every year since I was a child. He took a seat at a small table near the stage, ordered what looked like whiskey neat, and settled in to listen to the music. For 20 minutes, I just watched him, trying to work up the courage to approach. Part of me wanted to run over and hug him, overjoyed that he was alive, but another part of me was furious that he'd put us all through such unnecessary pain. Finally, I stood up and walked over to his table. When I tapped him on the shoulder, he turned around with a casual smile that immediately transformed into a look of absolute terror. "Danny?" he whispered, his face going completely white. "What are you doing here? How did you find me?" "A friend of mine took your picture at a Springsteen concert," I said, sitting down across from him without being invited. Imagine my surprise when I saw my dead uncle rocking out in the front row. Thomas looked around the club, nervously, as if expecting armed men to burst through the door at any moment. "You shouldn't be here, Danny. This is dangerous for both of us. If who finds out? Aunt Margaret told me about the money laundering and the threats, but that was over a year ago. Are these people still looking for you?" Thomas's laugh was bitter and humorless. "Looking for me? Danny, they never stopped looking for me. The difference is they think I'm dead, which means they've moved on to other priorities. But if they discover I'm alive, if they think there's even a chance I might still have that evidence—" "What evidence? Do you still have proof of the money laundering?" Thomas reached into his jacket and pulled out a small USB drive, holding it up so I could see it in the dim club lighting. "Everything's on here. Bank records, shell company documents, recorded phone conversations, Photos of cash transactions, enough to put a dozen people in prison for the rest of their lives. Then why haven't you turned it over to someone? The FBI, the state police, a prosecutor's office? Because I don't know who I can trust anymore, Thomas said, slipping the USB drive back into his pocket. The investigation I was supposed to be part of got shut down after 3 witnesses died in suspicious accidents. My FBI contact disappeared. The prosecutor who was supposed to handle the case got transferred to a different state. Someone with serious power and influence buried this whole thing. I leaned forward across the small table. Uncle Thomas, you can't keep living like this forever. You're missing Sarah's life. Her kids are growing up without their grandfather, and we're all still grieving your death. There has to be another way. Thomas's eyes filled with tears. Do you think I don't know that? Do you think I don't miss watching my grandkids grow up? But I've seen what these people do to families, Danny. I've seen innocent children get hurt because their parents crossed the wrong people. I'd rather stay dead than risk Sarah's kids getting kidnapped or worse. We sat in silence for several minutes, listening to the jazz trio play a haunting version of The Way You Look Tonight. Finally, I had an idea. What if we could find someone outside the local law enforcement system? Someone with no connections to the people who might be compromised? Thomas shook his head. I've thought about that, but I don't know who to trust anymore. For all I know, the corruption goes all the way to the top. What about the media? Investigative journalists who specialize in exposing corruption? If you gave them the evidence, they could publish it all at once, making it impossible to cover up. I could see Thomas considering this possibility, weighing the potential benefits against the risks. That might work, he said slowly, but it would have to be someone with a national platform, someone who couldn't be intimidated or bought off by local interests. Over the next hour, we discussed various options. Thomas had been following corruption cases in the news, and he mentioned several journalists who'd built careers exposing criminal organizations and government cover-ups. We settled on Rebecca Winters, an investigative reporter for a major newspaper who'd recently won a Pulitzer Prize for her series on police corruption. I'll reach out to her, I volunteered. I'll explain the situation and see if she's interested in the story. If she agrees to investigate, you can arrange to meet her somewhere safe and turn over the evidence. Thomas looked skeptical. And what if this backfires? What if the story gets killed or manipulated? What if these people retaliate against the family anyway? Then at least we'll have tried, I said. Uncle Thomas, you can't keep living in limbo forever, and we can't keep mourning someone who isn't actually dead. Something has to change. After another long silence, Thomas nodded slowly. Okay, but we do this carefully, with multiple backup plans, and if anything goes wrong, if there's even a hint that someone's been compromised, I disappear completely, and you never see me again. I spent the next week crafting a careful email to Rebecca Winters, explaining the situation in general terms, without revealing specific names or locations. I described my uncle's situation as a whistleblower who'd faked his death to escape retaliation from organized crime, and mentioned that he had extensive documentary evidence of money laundering and corruption. Rebecca's response came faster than I'd expected. She was definitely interested in the story, and suggested we set up a preliminary phone call to discuss details. She also recommended involving federal agents from outside our local jurisdiction, people who wouldn't have connections to any compromised investigations. The phone call with Rebecca lasted over 2 hours. She asked detailed questions about the evidence Thomas claimed to have, the timeline of events, and the reasons he'd chosen to fake his death rather than enter witness protection. By the end of the conversation, she was convinced the story was legitimate and significant enough to pursue. This sounds like it could be a major story, she told me. If your uncle's evidence is as comprehensive as you've described, it could expose corruption at multiple levels of government and law enforcement, but we'll need to be extremely careful about how we handle it. Rebecca arranged for us to meet with Special Agent Catherine Lopez from the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, someone based in Washington, D.C., with no connections to our local law enforcement community. The meeting was scheduled for the following week at a hotel in Baltimore, far enough from Philadelphia to minimize the chance of running into anyone connected to the criminal organization. I met Uncle Thomas at the jazz club again to update him on these developments. He looked nervous but determined, like a man who'd finally decided to stop running and face his problems head on. Are you sure about this FBI agent? He asked for the 3rd time. How do we know she hasn't been compromised too? We don't know for certain, I admitted. But Rebecca has worked with Agent Lopez on other corruption cases, and her track record suggests she's trustworthy. At some point, we have to take a calculated risk. The meeting in Baltimore was set for a Thursday morning in a conference room at a downtown hotel. Thomas arrived first, looking nervous, but carrying a leather briefcase that I assumed contained copies of his evidence. Rebecca arrived 15 minutes later with Agent Lopez, a serious-looking woman in her 40s who radiated competence and authority. Agent Lopez spent the first hour asking Thomas detailed questions about his background, his work at the construction company, and how he'd discovered the money laundering operation. She took extensive notes and occasionally asked for clarification on specific points. When Thomas finally opened his briefcase and began spreading documents across the conference table, Agent Lopez's demeanor changed noticeably. She leaned forward, studying bank records and shell company filings with intense concentration. This is extensive, she said, after reviewing the evidence for 30 minutes. If this documentation is authentic, it represents one of the largest money laundering operations we've seen in this region. How long were you gathering this evidence? About 8 months, Thomas replied. I started noticing irregularities in the company's books and began documenting everything I could find. I was planning to turn it all over to the FBI when I learned that the criminal organization had discovered my activities. Agent Lopez asked Thomas to walk her through specific documents, explaining the significance of various transactions and identifying key players in the operation. As the presentation continued, I could see her excitement growing. This was clearly bigger than she'd expected. Mr. Brennan, I'm prepared to offer you full federal protection in exchange for your cooperation with our investigation, she said finally. We can arrange for witness protection for you and your family members, and we can guarantee that this evidence will be presented to a federal grand jury within 6 months. Thomas looked at me, then at Rebecca, then back at Agent Lopez. What kind of protection are we talking about, and what would happen to my family? Agent Lopez explained the witness protection program in detail, describing how Thomas and potentially other family members could be relocated with new identities while the investigation and prosecution proceeded. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a way for Thomas to stop living in hiding while ensuring his safety and that of his family. I need to talk to my daughter before I make any decisions, Thomas said. She has children, and they deserve to know their grandfather, but I won't put them at risk. Over the following week, Thomas, Sarah, and I had several difficult family meetings. Sarah was initially angry that I'd tracked down her father and potentially put everyone in danger. But when she learned that he'd been alive all this time, hiding just a few hours away instead of being buried in the cemetery she visited every week, her anger transformed into relief and then determination. Dad, we can't keep living like this, she told him during one particularly emotional conversation. The kids ask about their grandpa all the time, and I have to keep telling them he's dead. Meanwhile, you're sitting in jazz clubs wishing you could be part of our lives. It's time to take the risk and try to get our family back. Agent Lopez worked with federal prosecutors to build a case around Thomas's evidence. The investigation expanded to include multiple agencies and jurisdictions as the scope of the money laundering operation became clear. Within 3 months, federal agents had arrested 12 people on charges ranging from money laundering to racketeering to conspiracy. The construction company where Thomas had worked was shut down, its assets frozen pending the outcome of the criminal cases. Several local law enforcement officials were arrested on corruption charges, including the police lieutenant who'd helped bury the original investigation. Rebecca's newspaper ran a series of articles about the case, describing how one man's courage in documenting criminal activity had led to one of the largest organized crime prosecutions in the region's history. The articles carefully avoided mentioning that Thomas had faked his death, instead describing him as a whistleblower who'd gone into hiding after receiving death threats. 6 months after our meeting in Baltimore, Thomas was able to return home under federal protection. The witness protection program wasn't necessary because most of the criminal organization's leadership was either in prison or had fled the country to avoid prosecution. Sarah's children were confused but overjoyed to discover that their grandfather was alive. At first, they couldn't understand why he'd been gone for so long or why everyone had told them he was dead. But they were too young to fully grasp the danger he'd been in, and they quickly adapted to having him back in their lives. The family held a second funeral service, this one to officially resurrect Uncle Thomas and celebrate his return to the living. It was a strange but cathartic experience, gathering at the same cemetery where we'd mourned his fake death and instead celebrating his survival and courage. Looking back, I'm grateful that Melissa showed me that concert photo, even though it turned our family's world upside down. Sometimes the truth is painful and complicated, but it's always better than living a lie, even when that lie was created with the best of intentions. 2 years later, Uncle Thomas is fully integrated back into family life, attending his grandchildren's school events and helping Sarah with home repairs, just like he used to do before everything went wrong. He still looks over his shoulder sometimes, still checks his car for tracking devices, but he's learning to live with normal levels of caution instead of constant fear. The jazz club still sees him on Wednesday nights, but now sometimes Sarah joins him, and occasionally I drive up from the city to share a drink and listen to music with the uncle I thought I'd lost forever.